And so Section 501 brings us into Title V, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And Section 501 is the findings and purpose for Subtitle A, which establishes universal suffrage. And a lot of the language in this subtitle comes from the For the People Act of 2021, HR 1. And this was the big election reform passed by the House more than a year ago. And the US Senate has done literally nothing with it except acknowledge that they received it. The House version, it included reenfranchisement of non-incarcerated Americans. So somebody who had previously been convicted and was no longer in prison would be able to participate in elections. Congresswoman Cori Bush of Missouri, she introduced an amendment to ensure incarcerated Americans could vote as well. And it did fail, but this is an issue that there's possible agreement on both ends of the spectrum. Lauren Boebert, the Congresswoman from Colorado, tweeted back in January, one citizen, one vote, end of story. And yes, that's what this subtitle does. One citizen, one vote, end of story. I'd like to just briefly read the findings into the record. The Congress finds the following. 1, Americans have a constitutional duty to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The ability to vote is the most basic conductive act of citizenship by which people can secure the blessings of liberty. 2, the United States is the only Western democracy that permits permanently excluding individuals with felony convictions from voting. Disenfranchising citizens who have been convicted of a criminal offense serves no compelling state interest and hinders rehabilitation and reintegration into society. 3, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution of the United States grants Congress ultimate supervisory power over federal elections, an authority which has repeatedly been upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. The 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments to the Constitution empower the Congress to enact measures to protect voting participation in federal elections. 4, basic constitutional principles of fairness and equal protection require an equal opportunity for all citizens of the United States to vote in federal elections. The purpose of this subtitle is to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity by including all citizens of the United States under the umbrella of civic responsibility. I was having a conversation with someone recently about voting, and they said, yeah, I absolutely believe when somebody's out of prison that they've served their time and they should be able to vote. And I said, well, can I ask you, what about somebody who's still incarcerated? And they just looked at me and said, I never thought about that. Why is it that someone who's incarcerated can't vote? Where does this idea come from? And it's fairly uncommon in democratic countries. There's at least 16 of them that allow felons to vote even while they're in prison. Radical countries like Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Switzerland, the Ukraine, Spain, South Africa. This idea that people should lose their ability to vote and to participate in democracy because they're incarcerated is pretty unusual. And only the United States and only a couple other countries restrict voting rights after a person's period of incarceration has ended. So we can be a better model of democracy by going after universal suffrage, one citizen, one vote, end of story. This touches on a number of other issues in our democracy and our history, like the idea of no taxation without representation. If you're paying taxes, you ought to be able to have some say in the people who represent you. You ought to be able to vote. If you're being incarcerated, if you're being prosecuted under the laws of your state, you should have some say in the people in deciding who writes those laws. This practice of disenfranchisement has also led to issues like prison gerrymandering, where congressional districts that have prisons in them, the people incarcerated there can be counted within that district, even though if they were able to vote, they would be represented elsewhere. And so this has the effect of, in many cases, of shifting population from urban areas into more rural areas where the prisons are located. And throwing off the balance of our representation in Congress. And there is very much an aspect of racial discrimination in this disenfranchisement. It comes from the text of the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, both which allowed for punishment of a crime as a reason to treat some citizens differently than others. And as it turns out, there are two states, Vermont and Maine, which still allow the incarcerated Americans to vote. And it's worth pointing out that those are the two whitest states in the nation. All the other states put restrictions on incarcerated Americans. When it comes to people who have been released, who served their time in prison and are back participating in society, then the question becomes, at what point do we allow them to also participate in democracy? And in some states, they are restricted. And in recent years, there have been a number of stories that have come out of formerly incarcerated Americans being charged with felonies for attempting to vote. A few years ago in Texas, Crystal Mason had served 3 years for tax fraud, and a year after her release, she cast a provisional ballot in the 2016 general election. And nobody had told her that she couldn't vote. She was free walking around rebuilding her life, and regardless, she got arrested and sentenced to 5 more years in prison for casting that provisional ballot, which she's still appealing that conviction. Recently in Tennessee, Pamela Moses, who is an activist, and she was recently sentenced to more than 6 years in prison for being convicted of illegally registering to vote because she had used paperwork from her probation officer that said she was eligible. And despite the fact that the mistake had been on his part, she was found guilty. And she was quoted in the Guardian newspaper as saying, quote, "It's a scare tactic, what they did to me. It's like, if she went to jail for that, we don't need to do that. We don't need to follow her because we're going to be in jail for 6 years too." I would say it sends a confusing message to people who want to vote. Why should people be worried if they're going to be prosecuted for doing their civic duty? We can do better. One citizen, one vote, end of story. In that case, the prosecutor blamed Pamela Moses for her sentence because he gave her a chance to plead to a misdemeanor with no prison time. And because she stood up for her right and requested a jury trial, she got convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Our criminal justice system is broken. And by ensuring that we can, and one of the ways to fix it is through the legislative process and the selection of representatives who will represent all the people. So the way to do that is one citizen, one vote, end of story. It's worth noting, the United States was kind of like one of the first modern democracy, and we got started in the 18th century by just letting white men of property vote, and it was better than what else was going on in the world at the time. And then the 18th century, we upgraded that and said, all right, Black men can vote too. And then in the 19th century, in the 20th century, we upgraded that and said, okay, women can vote too. And so now that it's the 21st century, it's time to upgrade our democracy again and say, everybody can vote. One citizen, one vote, end of story. That's the purpose of the subtitle. And next chair, that concludes my testimony for section 501.